time.
The gentlewoman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate my Republican colleagues for providing the American people with the clearest possible demonstration of how stark the differences are between the priorities of our nation's two major parties. We have before us a bill whose sole purpose is to funnel as much as $1 trillion over the next decade to a mere handful of our nation's richest families. It is telling that Republican leadership is so committed and so determined to see this legislation through that it called an emergency meeting of the Rules Committee last night to make sure it reached the floor this morning, even though this will not take effect for 4 years. Now, let me tell you, a bill that will expire is the Voting Rights Act, but we couldn't deal with that. This is the Republican definition of a national emergency, to get as much money as we can to the richest among us. It's not an unprecedented national debt. That doesn't bother them. A struggling middle class, no. Or the fact that tens of millions of Americans scrape by from paycheck to paycheck. Scrape by without health insurance, without help, and in many cases without hope. To get this bill to where it is today, Republicans had to ignore the needs of virtually every American citizen. The repeal of the estate tax will benefit less than 1% of the people in this country. But those few individuals that it helps will profit handsomely. Take Lee Raymond, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, who recently secured a retirement package worth almost $400 million, and who last year made more in a single day, probably in a single hour, than the average American family makes in an entire year. Lee stands to gain up to $211 million from this legislation that he won't pay tax on. President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and the officers of the cabinet won't do so badly either. Together, they will pocket anywhere from $91 to $344 million, just the cabinet. Now, people like these are among the 0.3% of super-rich Americans who pay an estate tax, and that's it. The other 99.7% don't see a dime. Such an astonishingly lopsided outcome is to be expected when we realize who is actually behind the bill. A recent report from the group Public Citizen revealed that 18 of the richest families in America, families worth a combined total of $185 billion, have been conducting a concerted and clandestine campaign on its behalf for a decade. We're talking about the families that are heirs to the fortune of companies like Walmart, Campbell's Soup, Mars Incorporated. These 18 families, Mr. Speaker, have spent $490 million in the last decade in their effort to pass this bill. Imagine that, $490 million to lobbyists. And if it does pass, their investment will certainly have been worth it, because over $71 billion will be headed their way. For years, supporters of a repeal of the estate tax have claimed the people they really want to help are America's small businesses and farmers. Well, as is so often the case, that is a lie. Small business families rarely, if ever, pay estate taxes. And the American Farm Bureau, one of the leading proponents of this repeal, has failed to provide even one legitimate example of a family that lost its farm because of estate tax. This is the kind of government Republicans have used their time and power to give us, Mr. Speaker. Multi-billionaires say jump and the majority says how high. Bills like this one are so outlandish and so entirely unjustifiable that they would be comical if they were not an assault on the strength of our union, which is, I might remind everyone, is at war. Consider the opportunity costs of this bill. For the up to $1 trillion federal dollars that this leadership plans to give away, we could fully insure every single American who does not have health insurance. All 44 million of them. Think of that. We could fully fund the Medicare Part D prescription plan. We could pay for all military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then we could use the money left over to fully fund No Child Left Behind. And finally, give every child in America the education the President promised when he took office. The sad thing is that what we have today is exactly the kind of legislation Americans should expect from a majority whose leader has bragged about never having voted for an increase in the minimum wage in his 25 years in politics. That's what we should expect from a party that wouldn't allow the Congress to adjust the minimum wage for inflation. A party that would have over the decades permitted it to remain at a pathetic $3.35 an hour. I would challenge my friends on the other side of the aisle to try surviving on that one for a month, Mr. Speaker, and think about the trillionaires up there who are going to say, you know, this is chump change to them and they don't care. But the notion that they would say that taking away the taxes of the very rich will stimulate the economy while increasing the pay of the weakest among us, the people who are least paid, will hurt the economy is an absurdity on its face. Mr. Speaker, this is a telling moment for this country. It's a moment in which this leadership clearly demonstrates once and for all what its priorities are. It's making the decision that educating our children is not worth the investment, that ensuring our parents and grandparents receive the prescription drugs they need is not worth the investment, that fixing our broken health insurance system isn't worth the investment, that curbing our crushing national debt isn't worth the investment, but investing in the ultra-rich is worth every single dime that can be squeezed out of the federal treasury. The bill embodies the very definition of America for sale. Today, Republicans are alone in this belief, Mr. Speaker. Great leaders throughout the history of our nation have understood that our collective strength lies in our support for the working and the middle class. They have understood that the extreme polarization of wealth this majority is ushering in is fundamentally bad for America, and among people who believe that are Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. I implore my friends on the other side of the aisle, for the sake of our children, for the sake of our future, for the sake of our military, for the sake of common decency, defeat this bill and begin again to work for the people of this nation and not against them. I reserve the balance of my time.